Witness the most shocking political collapse ever caught on camera. Watch till the end. Hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss another story of truth, power, and history in the making. The morning sun poured through the glass walls of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, stretching long shadows across the polished marble floor. Outside, diplomatic vehicles with tinted windows arrived in careful sequence, their engines humming against the slow stirrings of Ethiopia's capital. Inside the secure conference room, the air conditioning fought the creeping warmth, creating a sterile, almost surgical calm. Security teams from 3 nations took their positions, earpieces whispering coded updates. The rich scent of Ethiopian coffee lingered in the air, blending with the tension that hung thick as morning fog. Something historic was about to happen. Something no one had expected. President Trump's motorcade rolled in with its usual display, American flags snapping in the African breeze, the spectacle feeling slightly out of place here. His aides leaned close, murmuring last-minute briefings about the young African leader they were about to face, briefings that carried the dismissive tone of people who had never truly understood Africa's new generation. 30 minutes earlier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré had arrived without fanfare, stepping out of a modest black sedan with just 2 security officers. In the quiet of the car, he'd been reviewing documents, his uniform sharp and precise, the posture of a man whose victories came through strategy, not showmanship. The contrast was striking before a single word was spoken. 2 completely different approaches to power were about to meet, in one of the most unlikely diplomatic encounters of the decade. At the center of it all, an aging Ghanaian diplomat shuffled his notes nervously, tasked with moderating what many believed to be an impossible dialogue. The setting was designed for neutrality, a round table with no head, 2 flags standing at equal height, translation headsets neatly arranged, though destined to remain unused. Traoré's reputation had arrived ahead of him, the youngest head of state in Africa, fluent in multiple languages, and a tactician who studied his counterparts like a battlefield. Trump's team, however, had been briefed on an entirely different caricature, a generic African strongman, and completely missed the intellect they were about to confront. This wouldn't be a battle of armies or bank accounts. It would be a duel of minds and moral authority. Both men entered the room at the same moment, and the atmosphere seemed to tighten, charged with the clash of 2 distinct visions of leadership. Traoré's composed presence stood in sharp contrast to Trump's swagger. Their handshake lasted exactly 3 seconds, just enough for both to size up the other. In that instant, there was recognition, challenge, and the unspoken understanding that nothing here would go according to plan. Trump settled into his seat with the practiced ease of a man used to billion-dollar negotiations, his gold cufflinks catching the light as he straightened his tie. "So, Captain," he said, leaning into the title with a faint smirk, "I hear you've been making some noise in your part of Africa." His advisors nodded in silent approval, their folders thick with outdated reports that cast Traoré as just another coup leader hungry for attention. The American delegation came prepared for what they assumed would be a routine meeting with an African strongman, someone they could corner with economic pressure and political leverage. Trump's eyes swept the room with a dismissive glance, already calculating how quickly he could wrap this up. In his mind, this was a warm-up before meetings with what he considered real-world leaders later in the day. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, hands folded neatly on the table, his expression calm but watchful. He studied Trump's posture, gestures, and rhythm with the focus of a chess player reading his opponent's opening moves. Weeks of preparation had gone into this moment, not just studying Trump's policies and public statements, but dissecting the psychological patterns that drove his choices. Where Trump's team saw a young African officer, Traoré saw something else entirely, an aging businessman who had built his empire more on bluster than on substance. The captain's silence was intentional. He knew that impatient men often betrayed themselves when forced to fill an uncomfortable quiet. His dark eyes carried an intelligence that no briefing paper could have captured. "This will be interesting," he thought. "I've heard great things about your golf courses," Traoré said at last, his English crisp and unaccented. The unexpected remark caught Trump off guard. His face brightened instantly, as though someone had flipped a switch. Surprised that this young African leader knew about his business empire, he launched into a detailed, animated account of his latest resort development: marble fixtures, ocean views, championship-level greens. His voice rose with pride. Trump's advisors traded puzzled glances. This wasn't the hardline, transactional tone they had prepped for. Meanwhile, Traoré nodded along, occasionally asking precise, almost technical questions about golf course architecture and luxury hospitality. The young leader's knowledge was surprisingly deep, and it shifted the room's atmosphere. Trump didn't realize it yet, but he was walking straight into a carefully laid trap. The captain's questions weren't idle. Each one was a subtle probe into Trump's thinking, his priorities, his definition of value, the foundations of his decision-making. What Trump took as genuine admiration was, in reality, a map being drawn of his intellectual terrain. Traoré knew from military experience that the most decisive victories happen before the enemy realizes they're in a fight, and by the time Trump noticed the shift in conversation from golf resorts to African resource partnerships, it was already too late. "Your business success is impressive, Mr. President," Traoré said smoothly, sliding a leather portfolio onto the table. Inside were neatly arranged documents, far too prepared for a casual meeting. "But I'm curious about your perspective on resource partnerships in Africa." Trump straightened, sensing an opening to show his deal-making skill. His delegation leaned in. This was familiar ground, the kind of pitch Trump had delivered countless times. Traoré's pen hovered over a notepad as if he were ready to soak in wisdom from the master himself. "Africa has tremendous potential," Trump began, gesturing broadly, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had sold this vision before. "Untapped markets, natural resources just waiting for the right kind of development." Trump spoke with the practiced rhythm of a man who had pitched the same vision to investors and heads of state countless times before. Traoré nodded, occasionally jotting down neat notes that seemed to affirm Trump's points, playing the role of an eager student, learning from a seasoned mentor. The American advisors eased back in their seats, confident their president was in full control, schooling another world leader on the realities of global economics. Trump's hands moved more animatedly as he painted grand images of mining operations, agricultural ventures, and infrastructure projects that could unlock Africa's potential. He was so immersed in his own narrative that he failed to notice the quiet precision behind Traoré's polite attention. "That's fascinating," Traoré said, his voice calm and respectful. "But I wonder if you could help me understand something about these resource partnerships," still wearing the mask of deference. He opened his leather portfolio to reveal a spread of color-coded charts and precise financial projections. Trump leaned forward, ready to answer what he assumed would be a simple question. The captain's finger moved along a column of figures showing resource extraction profits compared to local economic gains across several African nations. His tone remained even, almost casual, as he began presenting data that point by point undermined everything Trump had just claimed. According to World Bank data, Traoré continued, most resource partnerships in Africa see 87% of profits leave the continent, while local communities see less than 3% improvement in their economies. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Trump's advisors scrambled through their briefing folders, hunting for counters they didn't have. Trump's smile faltered. This was not the softball diplomacy he had expected from a young military leader. Traoré's pen kept moving across his notepad, not just recording numbers, but studying every flicker of Trump's expression, every shift in posture as the pressure mounted. The quiet student was revealing himself as a strategist, and the lesson was just beginning. Trump's jaw tightened. His instincts told him this was a challenge he needed to push back on fast. If he was to keep control of the room. "Those numbers don't tell the whole story, Captain," Trump said, his tone sharpening into the familiar edge he used with journalists who strayed into uncomfortable territory. He moved into his standard defense jobs created, infrastructure built, gesturing for his advisors to provide backup. But they were still rifling through papers, unprepared for the depth of Traoré's challenge. The friendly tone of the meeting was gone. The tension had shifted into a contest. Trump's gold pen tapped against the table in a slow, controlled rhythm, a habit he had when irritation began to creep in. Across from him, Traoré allowed the faintest smile to appear before turning another page in his portfolio. This time, he revealed high-resolution satellite images of mining sites across West Africa. "You're absolutely right about job creation, Mr. President," he said, still perfectly courteous, but his eyes carried a quiet satisfaction as he slid the images forward. They showed massive extraction facilities surrounded by villages steeped in poverty, alongside detailed employment figures that undercut every claim Trump had just made. Traoré's finger moved slowly across the images, tracing the thin line where lucrative mining zones ended and struggling villages began. The pictures spoke louder than any speech could. His voice stayed calm, courteous even, but each word was chosen with surgical precision to dismantle the very foundation of Trump's economic worldview. The American president's advisors exchanged uneasy glances. It was becoming clear their briefing packets were useless against this level of preparation. In Burkina Faso alone, Traoré continued, sliding a spreadsheet across the table. Foreign mining companies extracted $2.3 billion in gold, yet local employment rose by only 0.7%. The figures were laid out with the precision of a military operation, clean, exact, irrefutable. A flush crept across Trump's face as the realization hit. He had stepped straight into a trap. His boasts about unlocking African prosperity now sounded hollow, stripped of their shine by the cold weight of numbers. His delegation watched, tight-lipped, as their president wrestled with facts that didn't bend to his narrative. Traoré's assault was relentless, but wrapped in such professional courtesy that Trump couldn't dismiss him without looking defensive and unprepared. The conference room had quietly transformed into a classroom, with the young captain as the professor and the American president failing his first exam. Each chart was another nail in the coffin of Trump's assumed intellectual dominance. "These partnerships you described," Traoré said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of lived experience, "remind me of contracts my grandfather signed in the 1970s. The personal note landed like a precision strike. Suddenly, the data wasn't just numbers, it was history, family, and the unbroken thread of broken promises." Traoré's eyes held the inherited wisdom of generations as he described how prosperity had been promised to African communities time and time again, and how it had consistently failed to arrive. Trump opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time, no words came. It wasn't just that his opponent was better prepared. It was that this fight meant something deeply personal to him. The battlefield was no longer economic, it was emotional, historical, and Traoré owned every inch of it, with deliberate, unhurried movements. The captain closed his economic portfolio and reached for another folder. Trump's gaze followed the motion, a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. "Since we're discussing partnerships, Mr. President," Traoré began, "perhaps we should examine the historical context that shapes Africa's view of these agreements." He opened a leather-bound folder to reveal colonial maps layered over modern resource extraction zones. The overlap was unmistakable. Even Trump's advisors shifted uncomfortably. Traoré's finger moved again, this time tracing the boundaries of former French colonies, showing how present-day mining concessions mirrored the territorial divisions of the late 19th century. The silence in the room was heavy. Now the captain's tone shifted. He was no longer the economist, he was the historian. His calm authority filled the space between them. "The Berlin Conference of 1884. He began, his voice carrying the slow, deliberate cadence of a professor addressing an unprepared student. "Divided Africa among European powers. Without a single African representative at the table." Trump shifted in his chair, the limits of his knowledge pressing in on him. For the first time, it was clear he was no longer leading this meeting. He was being led. Traoré's presentation laid bare how colonial boundaries were engineered for one purpose: maximizing resource extraction, while splintering ethnic groups and severing traditional trade routes. The maps made the strategy clear: divide communities, disrupt their economies, then rebuild their dependencies in ways that outlived independence. The names on the rulers may have changed, but the system had not. Modern corporations had simply stepped into the shoes of colonial governors. exploiting the same vulnerabilities under a new flag. Trump's advisors scribbled furiously. Finally, realizing the scale of their miscalculation, they had underestimated not just a leader, but a historian, an economist, and a strategist all in one. Across the table, Trump's face flushed deeper with every revelation, as the thought sank in his own business empire operated within structures built on centuries of exploitation. "What's fascinating," Traoré said, turning a page to reveal a faded photograph of his grandfather in uniform, "is how these historical patterns still shape our economic relationships today." The image landed like a blow. This was no abstract debate. Trump was speaking to a man whose bloodline had lived through the direct consequences of every policy he was defending. Traoré's tone never wavered, but every word carried the sharp edge of truth. He described with surgical precision how promises of development and partnership had been the cover for resource theft for over a century. Each historical parallel to modern trade agreements dismantled Trump's talking points, layer by layer, while keeping the veneer of perfect diplomatic respect. The captain's eyes seemed to hold the weight of generations' eyes that had seen empires rise and fall through the very tactics Trump believed to be fresh innovations. For the first time, Trump sat wordless, his real estate success stories feeling paper thin in the face of such history. "My grandfather always told me," Traoré said, his voice low but resonant, "that those who ignore history are doomed to repeat its mistakes." It was more than a statement, it was a verdict. Trump's mouth opened, but nothing came. His usual arsenal of comebacks, deflections, and swagger simply had no place here. The conference room had shifted into something far more dangerous, a courtroom with colonialism on trial and Trump unwittingly cast as the defendant. Every attempt to defend modern business collapsed under the weight of documented history that Traoré presented with devastating clarity. The American delegation looked on in quiet alarm. Their president was being dismantled, piece by piece, by a man young enough to be his son. The history lesson ended, but its wreckage was obvious. Trump's carefully constructed worldview lay in ruins around him. Then Trump's face hardened. A survival instinct kicked in. If this battlefield was lost, he would move to one where American dominance was unquestionable. "Let's talk about real security, Captain," he said, his voice regaining a flicker of its old bravado as he leaned forward, and with that, he began outlining military aid packages, weapons deals, and joint training programs. His tone carried the implication that African nations needed American protection to withstand the dangers of the world. His advisors perked up, sensing a return to familiar ground. Trump's gestures grew sharper as he detailed advanced weapons systems and elite training regimens, certain this would expose the limits of his young counterpart. The energy in the room shifted again. This was Trump's comfort zone, the language of power projection. But across the table, Traoré remained perfectly still. The only change was in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, the subtle look of a man who knew his opponent had just stepped directly into his strongest arena. "Military strategy is indeed crucial, Mr. President," Traoré replied, his voice steady with the quiet confidence of someone who had commanded troops in battle, not just signed defense contracts. He opened another section of his portfolio, revealing a series of detailed reports on recent U.S. military operations in Africa and the Middle East. His finger moved over mission timelines and casualty figures with the precision of a man who understood that war was not an abstract policy tool, but a matter of human lives and national survival. Trump's advisors shifted uneasily. It was becoming clear that their opponent's military credentials were no formality. This was a man who had toppled governments through strategy and discipline, not inherited power. "Your military aid to Chad, for example," Traoré continued, still perfectly polite but with a commander's edge in his gaze, "resulted in $847 million in weapons sales. Yet it failed to address the root causes of instability." The numbers rolled off his tongue with the ease of someone who had studied every U.S. military intervention in Africa for the past 20 years. Trump's confident smile began to falter. The young captain's knowledge reached into areas even some of Trump's own team hadn't fully been briefed on. The analysis was merciless in its accuracy. exposing how U.S. military aid often prolonged conflicts, feeding arms manufacturers while doing little to secure lasting peace. Traoré dismantled the mythology of American military dominance with the calm detachment of a soldier who had seen empires collapse from strategic overreach. The room went still. Trump struggled to counter arguments rooted in hard combat experience. "The interesting paradox," Traoré said, his tone shifting to that of an academy instructor addressing a failing cadet, "is how the world's most expensive military continually struggles against opponents who understand their own terrain better than foreign advisors ever could." Each sentence landed like a calculated strike, exposing the weaknesses in American doctrine when applied to African realities. Traoré spoke as a man who had personally outmaneuvered forces armed and trained by global powers, relying not on superior technology, but on sharper strategy. Trump's complexion paled. He was beginning to see that his adversary wasn't just intellectually formidable. He was a proven military mind who had prevailed against far stronger forces. Every attempt to assert dominance was turning into an admission of his own limits. "Look, Captain," Trump began, his voice cracking under the strain, "at the end of the day, leadership is about getting results, about winning." His hands moved rapidly, his gestures growing more frantic as he fell back on his core belief that success justified any means, that power was proof of its own virtue. His advisors exchanged tense glances. The gold watch on Trump's wrist caught the light as his hand trembled, a small but telling sign that the pressure was taking its toll. The air in the room had grown heavy, suffocating, as the American president realized his worldview was being dismantled in real time. Traoré leaned back in his chair, calm and steady, as if he had been waiting for this precise moment. "Mr. President," he said, his voice carrying both ancestral wisdom and the weight of his own sacrifices. "True leadership isn't about winning. It's about serving something greater than yourself." The words cracked through the room like thunder, exposing the unbridgeable gulf between two opposing philosophies of power. "When I took power in Burkina Faso," Traoré continued, his voice gaining strength, "it wasn't for personal glory or business gain. It was because my people deserved leaders who would die for them rather than profit from them." The moral divide was now laid bare. Trump's restless, defensive energy stood in stark contrast to the captain's unshakable calm. The final blow was no longer about economics, history, or even military tactics. It was about the essence of leadership itself. Trump's face tightened, his expression twisting as he struggled to grasp a worldview where leadership meant service, not domination, where victory was measured in a people's freedom, not in personal fortune. Across from him, the young African leader's words carried the weight of lived sacrifice, making Trump's decades of business deals and self-branded success look hollow by comparison. Each sentence from Traoré landed like a hammer blow, striking directly at the foundation of Trump's understanding of power. The room was silent, the stillness heavy with the realization that the moral contrast between the two men was no longer just visible, it was undeniable. "You speak of winning, Mr. President," Traoré said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had fought and won the only battles that mattered, those for human dignity and national sovereignty. "But what have you truly won for your people, beyond division and debt?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above Trump's unraveling composure. Everyone in the room knew he could not answer it. The captain's moral authority seemed to expand into every corner of the conference room, dwarfing the symbols of wealth and power that Trump had spent his life collecting. His mouth opened, but no words came. In that moment, he seemed to understand painfully that he had built a life on the appearance of leadership, without ever embodying it. The blow was precise and devastating. It revealed not only the limits of Trump's intellect, but a deeper poverty of spirit that no amount of money or status could disguise. The battle was nearly over, and Trump stood defenseless against an opponent who fought with principles instead of profit. His hands shook visibly. A sheen of sweat formed on his forehead. The familiar weapon's mockery, deflection, bravado were useless here. "You don't understand," he stammered, his voice high and unsteady, the words spilling out in a rush. "I've built an empire. I've created jobs. I've made America great again." The slogans rang hollow, echoing around the room like fragments of a broken speech. His advisors looked on in disbelief as their president's fabled confidence crumbled. The gold pen in his trembling fingers slipped from his grasp and clattered against the table. The small metallic sound punctuating the collapse. The air grew thick, charged with the electricity of watching one of the world's most powerful men dismantled in real time. Traoré didn't move. His gaze, dark and steady, carried both pity and disappointment. "Mr. President," he said softly, his tone like that of a father correcting a misguided child. "An empire built on the suffering of others is not an achievement. It is a tragedy." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable peeling away what remained of Trump's fragile defenses. Traoré's calmness made the contrast even sharper, his composure throwing Trump's erratic energy into stark relief. Everyone in the room could feel it. The breaking point had come. Trump's last psychological defenses were gone, and the seismic shift in the balance of power was complete. "Your greatness," Traoré continued, his voice carrying the authority of historical judgment, "is measured by how many you've exploited, not how many you've liberated." Trump's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. His breathing grew uneven, his body language betraying a man who had never been forced to confront the moral weight of his actions. The attack was relentless, yet delivered with such calm certainty that no insult, no deflection, could shield him. Decades of self-deception and carefully crafted mythology were stripped away, leaving him exposed and defenseless. The room felt like a courtroom at the moment of sentencing. Trump was the defendant, and everyone could see he had no defense left. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, his once commanding presence reduced to incoherent sputtering. You can't, this isn't," he stammered, his fragmented words revealing a mind collapsing under pressure. His eyes darted around the room, seeking rescue from advisors who sat frozen, equally stunned by the systematic dismantling they had just witnessed. His hands tugged at his tie as if loosening it might let him breathe through the suffocating weight of exposed inadequacy. The transformation was complete, from confident dealmaker to broken man in less than an hour. The blow had not only destroyed his arguments, it had shattered his sense of self. Traoré glanced at his watch with the precision of a commander timing a final strike. His voice dropped to a quiet, commanding whisper that drew more attention than any shout could have. "Mr. President, you have exactly 3 minutes to explain why Africa should trust American leaders. Hip when your own people are abandoning you." Trump's eyes widened in panic. This was no longer a debate, it was an execution. Traoré's finger tapped once against the table, marking the start of the countdown. His dark eyes held no malice, only the cold certainty of someone who had calculated this moment to the second. The American delegation sat in stunned silence as their leader faced an intellectual firing squad. "With no ammunition left, I built my businesses. Trump began, his voice cracking like thin ice. The words fell apart in his throat under Traoré's unflinching gaze. His hands moved aimlessly in the air, reaching for arguments that no longer existed. The man who once thrived on dominance now stammered like a student who had been caught bluffing in front of the entire class. "2 minutes," Traoré announced softly. Like a judge pronouncing the inevitable, Trump's breathing grew ragged, his attempts at recovery dissolving into disconnected fragments about golf courses and television ratings. His mind could no longer separate his business triumphs from his political failures. Both lay exposed as hollow achievements built on moral emptiness. The color in his face deepened to purple as the weight of his inadequacy crushed his ability to think. The destruction was measured in minutes and seconds, not hours or days. "Time," Traoré said at last. The single word fell like a gravestone, sealing the tomb of Trump's intellectual identity. The American president slumped in his chair, mouth open, eyes vacant, a man who no longer remembered what victory felt like. With a quiet snap, Traoré closed his portfolio. The sound echoed through the silent room like distant thunder. The mission was complete, executed with the precision of a strategist who had planned each move from the start. Trump's advisors stared at the collapsed figure of their leader, witnesses to the total dismantling of a man who had never faced an opponent capable of challenging and destroying his entire worldview in exactly 3 minutes. The defeat was total, irreversible, and now part of history. Traoré rose from his chair with the calm bearing of a soldier returning from a battle already won. His dark eyes swept across the American delegation, letting each of them feel the weight of what they had just witnessed, not a personal victory, but the symbolic restoration of African dignity. After centuries of condescension, his leather portfolio closed with a second, definitive snap that seemed to carry through the corridors of history. The moment would be remembered not as the humiliation of one man, but as the day Africa reclaimed its intellectual sovereignty on the world stage. The Ghanaian mediator, normally unshakable after decades in diplomacy, sat frozen in awe. He had never seen such a complete demolition delivered with precision, discipline, and moral clarity. Trump's shallow, uneven breaths were the only sound as his blank eyes stared at the table. His advisors exchanged horrified glances, knowing they would have to explain to the world how their president had been broken not by weapons or war, but by truth. Traoré stepped toward the door, then paused. Turning back, he spoke with the gentle firmness of a teacher offering a final lesson to a failed student. "Africa," he said, "is no longer waiting for your permission to be great." The words hung in the air like a declaration of independence. It was not just the end of a meeting, it was the start of a new era, one where moral authority outweighed military might or economic leverage. Trump's head remained bowed in silent defeat, the unspoken acknowledgement clear. The door closed softly behind Traoré, the sound marking the turning of a page in history. Africa had reclaimed its dignity. American arrogance had been buried. The battle was over, and there was no doubt who had won.